Matthew 5, verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled.
Thank you for inviting me again. It's lovely to be here with you guys. Matt says that we're in this series of the Beattitudes, and I get verse 6 this morning. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Those of you with a good memory will remember that I actually used this as part of what I said when I spoke last time I came. So forgive me if you've heard some of what I say, if there's some repeats in there. A very wise man once told me that if a sermon is worth preaching, it's worth preaching 3 times. So in honour of my father, the very wise man, here we go. The Beatitudes are part of what are called the Sermon on the Mount. There's about 3 chapters in Matthew that are the Sermon on the Mount. But we could actually call it, that whole sermon, we could call it what it means to call God Father, what it means to call God Father. I believe that the Beatitudes themselves, as part of this sermon, are not a list of how we should live, but a guide to the attitude that this living should stem from. A heart focused on being disciples, being imitators of Jesus. The Beatitudes, or the Beatitudes, are how... or the attitudes of how we should live. It's a heart thing. It's a way of thinking, so that our discipleship is not something we put on like a coat or a pair of shoes. It's a natural response to the attitude of our heart. It's part of us, a subconscious way of being, as well as an intentional way of living. Living near the airport, I'm sure you'll notice, and will have noticed many times, that as a plane comes down to land, there's a point at which it lifts its nose. And that's so that the main wheels of the plane can hit the runway first before the nose wheel, otherwise the nose wheel would just collapse. The direction that it's going in doesn't change. The fact that it's losing altitude doesn't change, but it just lifts its nose up. And that's what pilots call the attitude of the plane. How it is, the attitude of the plane. It doesn't change where it's going. It doesn't change how it's losing height or direction, but it changes its attitude. The angle of the plane itself is not about the journey. It's about the attitude at which it undertakes that journey. And I think that's an absolutely brilliant example of how effective true discipleship is. Not working to a tick list, a formula, or obeying a bunch of rules. It's a natural outflowing from our heart of the Spirit within us. We don't do it because the rules and the laws say we should. We do it because it reflects the heart of God, who we worship, and who calls us to be imitators, to be disciples. Your actions back up your words, because your words flow from a heart whose attitude is centered on Jesus. So that's a little bit of an introduction. The verse, as we've already seen, that Matt has given me is verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. You may remember last time I paraphrased that and said this: blessed are those who see that things aren't the way that God intended them to be. And so they hunger and they thirst for. They live their lives as an example of the way that God intended things to be. If you're truly hungry, not just feeling a bit peckish, if you're truly thirsty, not just a bit dry, then you don't just sit around waiting for the food and drink to arrive. You do everything in your power to find that refreshment your body is so desperately crying out for. We're going to take a bit of a detour, if that's all right, and we're going to have a quick look at a couple of points from the book of Ezra and the book of Haggai in the Old Testament, because I think they give us a great picture to help us understand the concept that we're talking about a little bit more here. So in chapter 1 of Haggai, there's a fairly well-known verse in verse 3, and it says this: "Is this a time for you yourselves to be living in your panelled houses?" The interpretation of panelled houses there is finished houses or houses with roofs. Whilst this house, the temple, remains in ruins. Back in Genesis, we see that God sets apart the people of Israel to be an example to the nations around them of the way that he intended things to be, a people who would draw other nations to him. But Israel had themselves strayed so far from God's intent and from his will that somewhere around 600 BC, he allowed Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, to conquer Jerusalem, and he took the people into exile. About 70 years later, around 530 BC, Babylon was conquered by the Persians. And in the first year of his reign, King Cyrus allowed any Israelites who were willing to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Once they'd returned and started to rebuild the temple, the people who'd moved into the land while they'd been in exile got a bit upset about this. They got a bit annoyed, and they tried to discourage them. And eventually, they wrote to the new king, King Artaxerxes, or however you pronounce it. I can never pronounce that one. To say that the rebuilding was an act of rebellion. And as a result, the king ordered them to stop the building. And in verse 23 of Ezra chapter 4, we read, "As soon as they received the letter, those opposing the work went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop." And that's when this prophecy comes in. That's when Haggai speaks this word. Is it right that you should be living in your comfortable, completed houses while the temple is still at ground level? It's time to stick your head above the parapet. It's time to show whose you are and who it is that you trust. I think it's important to note here that God wasn't upset with the people for building themselves nice, comfortable houses. He didn't want them to live on the streets. He didn't want them to be homeless. He was quite happy for them to have houses of their own. He was upset that they'd become so comfortable in those nice houses that they'd forgotten the purpose of them being back in Jerusalem. He'd moved the heart of Cyrus so that they could return and build the temple. And more importantly, they could restore the outward sign of their relationship with him. But they totally lost the vision and opted for a comfortable, inconspicuous life away from the wrath of those who opposed them. They'd almost hidden themselves away in their houses. What a great story. But what does it have to do with our verse in the Beattitudes? Well, as I've already said, if we truly hunger and thirst for righteousness, for the way God intended things to be, then we'll put our faith into action by doing everything in our power to see that righteousness become a reality. This is not a passive verse. It's Jesus giving us a call to show our faith by our action. Action that stems from the heart that is truly devoted to being more like him and reflecting his heart to the world around us. And why would that surprise us? You only have to look at the rest of Jesus' time on earth to know that he was a man of action as well as words. In fact, action usually came before the words in his case, before the explanation. I think it's significant that the very next passage in this chapter in Matthew is that passage where he says, you're the salt of the earth and you're the light of the world. Who puts a light under a bushel? Who sets salt on a table that is no longer salty? It's only good for the rubbish heap. Later in Matthew's gospel, we read the parable of the talents. And again, Jesus is calling his hearers to faith in action. We know the story well, don't we? The master gives 3 of his servants some money, some bags of money. And to one he gives 10 talents, to one he gives 5, to another he gives 3. And there's a very important phrase in that each time he says, each according to their ability. Each according to their ability. None of these servants could say that they had been overwhelmed and they couldn't cope with what it is that the master had given to them, because he gave them according to their abilities. And he was proved right, wasn't he? Because the guys who he gave the most to did the most with it, but the guy who he gave the least to went off and buried it in the ground. And you know, God gives us so much, doesn't he? And he gives us according to our abilities. And he doesn't expect us to go off and bury it in the ground, to keep it to ourselves. He expects us to stick our head above the parapet. He expects us to invest what it is that he's given to us, to invest it in building his kingdom. The second thing in that passage is it says they went at once. They went at once and put their money, or their master's money to work. There was an urgency here. There was an urgency in what they had to do. And so they went off, and 2 of them went off and got that heart of the master and went and invested that money. And you know, there's an urgency to what God is calling us to do. There's an urgency that says we need to get on with it. So often we can sit back and think, well, we'll just have a think about this. We'll just work this out. We'll just see what it is that we should do here. When actually God's already given us what it is we need. And he just wants us to get on with it. The third point I want us to see from that passage is that to show they understood the master's intent and heart, these servants had to make an effort and they had to take a risk. You can go back quite a lot there. I've expanded that a little bit. Don't worry about that. If you go back to the beginning of slide 6, that's great. Otherwise, you reveal all my points ahead of when I'm going to make them. So, yeah, they had to show that they understood the master's intent and heart, and so they had to make an effort and they had to take a risk. You know, we know the end of the story, don't we? Because we've read it so many times. But actually, if you look at it from a literal perspective, they didn't know the end of the story. They had to go off and they had to make an effort and they had to take a risk. You know, I'm sure if the guy who had 10 talents had come back to the master at the end of it and he said, well, master, I went off and I thought I'd got hold of your heart here and I invested your money. But shares in tent making dropped through the floor and I've only got 2 talents left now. I'm sure his master would have been more pleased with him than the guy who went off and buried it in the ground. And you know, God calls us sometimes to step out in faith and take a risk. He calls us to get on with it and make an effort. And it's amazing what he can do with our gift and our effort if we get stuck in and do it for him. So let's bring this into land. To do that, I'd love us to look at the three endings of those three passages that we've looked at. Our verse in the Beatitudes says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." They will be filled. If we truly hunger and thirst for righteousness, if we truly live our lives as an example of the way God intended things to be, then we will see the righteousness that we hunger and thirst for. We will see things return to the way that God intended them to be. That's called faith. That's what that's about. Faith is actually seeing that if we do what it is that God calls us to do, then he will take what we do and he will multiply it immensely and bring about what it is that he wants to bring about. Our second ending is from the return of God's people to Jerusalem. The people responded to Haggai's prophecy and restarted the building process. They stuck their head above the parapets. And as expected, there was immediate opposition. Another letter to the king, this time to Darius. I think they changed their kings like they changed their coats by the sound of things in this place. So, there was another letter that went to Darius. And in Ezra chapter 5, we read, at that time, Chesterton, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shetar, a guy whose name is unpronounceable, and their associates went to them and asked, "Who authorized you to rebuild the temple and to finish it?" They also asked, "What are the names of those who are constructing the building?" And then it goes on to say, "But the eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped until the report could go to Darius and his written reply be received." They shot themselves in the foot, basically, these guys who were the opposition, because they sent this letter to Darius, and Darius ordered for a search to be made of the records, and he found the original decree from Cyrus. And he wrote back saying, "Thanks for letting me know. Now I want you to make sure that they have everything that they need to make sure no one tries to stop them. And by the way, I want you to pay for the materials and anything that they need for regular sacrifices out of your local government taxes." So they really shot themselves in the foot, didn't they? There's that faith bit again. If you stick your head above the parapet and show whose you are and who you serve, then God will do immeasurably more than you can ask or imagine. Our final ending is from the parable of the talents, and it comes in the form of a warning. Because that last verse of the passage says, "Take the talent from the guy who's got one and give it to the guy who's got 10. Because everybody who has much will be given even more. And he who has a little, even what he has, will be taken away from him." I don't know about you, but when I used to read that, I used to think, God, that doesn't sound like you. I thought you were the God of the little guy. You know, you were the God of the guy who hadn't got very much, and that you looked after the guy who hadn't got very much. And I'm sure you've all got bits in the Bible like this. I used to stick it at the back of my head, and I used to think, I hope nobody ever asks me a question about that, because I couldn't explain it. And then one day, God gave me this sentence, this quote: "Use it or lose it." No, go back to that. That was the very last one on that last slide. That's it. That's all right. Don't worry. Use it or lose it. If you don't use the gift that God has given you, you'll lose the ability to use it. My brother is a great guitarist, and he regularly lets me know how many millions of chords he knows and how many songs he can play and all that sort of thing. And he is good, to be honest, but I never tell him that. But I bet you that if he put his guitar down and he didn't play it for 2 years, and he came back and tried to play it again, he wouldn't be as good as he is now. And that's what this passage is saying. If you don't use the gift that God has given you, you'll lose the ability to use it. If we don't pray every day, we find it difficult to pray. If we don't read our Bible every day, we find it difficult to get something out of it when we come to read it again. What will you do today to hunger and thirst? To live your life as an example of the way that God intended things to be? What will you do today to show whose you are and in whom you're putting your faith and your trust? What will you do today to invest the gift and the abilities that God has given you to build his kingdom? Why don't we just take a few moments quietly? I'd love for you just to think about that. Think about those 3 questions. Have I got them listed on the next slide? I can't remember. There we go. That'll do. That's great. Just think about this. And then I'd love it if you were able just to maybe just in 2s and 3s, just share a little bit of what it is that you think that you could do, and then pray for each other. Would that be all right if you can pray for each other? If you're a pray on my own silent person, then that's fine. Just sit and pray. If you'd like to get together with 2 or 3 other people near you, then that's great to do that as well. And then when that time comes to an end, I think Matt's going to come up and round us off in prayer. Is that all right, Matt?
grace, not I, but through Christ in me. Just a few things to mention. I forgot to mention it during notices. Tonight we have an evening service here at 6:30, so if you can make that about an hour long from 6:30 this evening. A reminder of our church meeting and AGM tomorrow here at 7:30. And please do come forward if you would like some prayer. We would love to be able to pray for you and with you. And if you are able to help on Thursday and you can give your time between 1:30 and 2:30, please do let me know. Thank you to Mike for sharing your word this morning, and pray it was a challenge, and we will be challenged by it this week. Well, let's close together by saying the grace. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen. God bless you all. Please stay with a cup of tea, a coffee, a biscuit. If you're joining us online, have a lovely week this week, and hopefully see you at some point during the week as well. God bless.